disappointing. I shall have to go all out on some modifications. I wonder if I could ask you to do something. Of course, anything I can.
In order for us not to come across as just a couple of evangelicals, either being accused of taking the Vatican's astronomers out of context or just taking cheap shots at them, we decided that the only way that we were really going to be able to provide an authoritative answer was we was going to have to go to the top of Mount Graham and meet with the Jesuit astronomers and ask them face to face, and if they would allow us, even put them on film, which they did, and ask them these questions. Where are you coming from with all of this? And we even also asked them about Malachi Martin's statements and all of that. Now, here's something that people need to know, though. For us to go to the top of Mount Graham, you don't just get in a car and drive up to the top of the mountain and jump out and say, we're here to see the aliens, right? I mean,
not all the people should do that, at least.
Yeah,
huh?
They better not try it because, far down off the top of that mountain, there are huge fences that run around. This thing's like a military complex. There's signs in different languages on these giant fences talking about all the terrible stuff they're going to do to you if you try to climb over.
Jeez.
Even when you go through with a guide, which is what we had to do, we negotiated this through the Arizona State University and went up there with a guide who had keys to the gate. They still have to radio ahead to tell them that they're coming up. When you get up there, literally the walkways have like these reinforcements that run around them, and our guide said, do not step over those railings into any part of the woods. You stay on the walkways because if you do, they'll arrest you. And there was law enforcement up there. So, I mean, it's
you might endanger a red squirrel or something like that.
Exactly.
All right.
Bottom line, long story, I think we did a show on that. The book, by the way, Exo-Vaticana, that was based on us, like 600 pages. It's been called, Chuck Misler, our friend, said it was the best book on astrobiology from a religious worldview that's ever been published, ever been written. And so we were pretty proud of it. We're giving that book away. We're giving Petrus Romanus away. In fact, right now at skywatchtv.com, people go over there. They can read about that, and they can see how they can get like $200 worth of this stuff for nothing. So so I'm not trying to pitch a book when I'm mentioning the title of Exo-Vaticana, but they can read in there what we did. We went up there. We met with the Vatican astronomer on duty. They let us climb all over.
Did they know you were coming?
I believe they did because we communicated this through, the guide. Yeah, I'm sure they knew we were coming up there that day because actually the Jesuit was ready to meet us when we got there. So I know they knew we were coming. And I should say this too. Even though I'm not a Catholic, I have to say that this guy in many, many ways illustrated to me the kind of behavior that a Christian ought to have. Very cordial, very nice, was willing to show us everything. They let us climb all over the advanced telescope. But anyway, long story short, we were there for a while. Then we went, there's 3 telescopes on the top of Mount Graham. We went to the one further up the hill, which is a radio telescope. And ultimately, we wound up at the large binocular telescope where we spent hours. They gave us the lead engineer. He dedicated his entire day just to me and Chris, and we had a cameraman with us. People can go to YouTube and type it in. They can see me and Chris walking around up there on the mountain and inside the large binocular telescope. And it's inside the LBT is where the Lucifer device is at.
Now, what is the Lucifer device, Tom?
Yeah, it's a very advanced piece of infrared technology. It sits in between the gigantic 2 twin mirrors of the large binocular telescope. Cris Putnam is the only guy on the planet that can actually tell you what the acronym stands for, Lucifer. Maybe he can do that later.
And who named that?
Well, the German astronomers were involved with it, but what you have to know is on the top of Mount Graham, that's a consortium. All of the astronomers up there from all around the world, from all of the nations of the world, work together up there as a consortium. So we were told that the Germans might have been kind of, poking fun at the Vatican presence on the top of the mountain.
Okay.
But the bottom line is they can use the Lucifer device to look deeper into space and further back into time, and the LBT is the largest telescope of its kind in the world. And when we were up there, there was a whole lot of stuff that happened. One, we were really surprised at how openly the astronomers up there talked about UFOs. We didn't go up there to even ask that question. We didn't want them to think we came up there, like some loons or something that were just looking for a cheap thrill. We were trying to keep this very scholarly. But they were just talking about it openly. We were sitting inside the control room for the LBT, and the lead engineer was in there with us talking, and there were several astronomers sitting in there with me and Chris and our cameraman, and they just talked openly about how people around the world have to make application to be able to use that gigantic telescope, and how often when they're looking into deep space, they essentially have to wait, sometimes for what evidently appears to be large armadas of ships, or whatever they are, UFOs. They have to wait for them to get out of the way so they can study. We were just astonished that they were talking so openly about that. But the other thing is they are using LBT now, primarily is being used for a couple of things, to try to study dark matter, fine dark matter, dark energy. CERN is working on some of the same stuff. Some of their people are connected with this. They are monitoring something that is approaching the Earth, and the LBT, the Lucifer device, is able to see stuff in deep space that regular telescopes cannot see, and the human eye cannot see. And so whatever it is they're watching, whatever it is that Malachi Martin was talking about, remains a mystery, but the fact that the Vatican has ramped up their discussion about aliens and alien life. And in fact, if you recall, and I don't want to dominate the conversation here, but let me say one other thing. If you recall, when Malachi Martin made that comment years ago, he put about a 10-year time frame on it, and he thought that in about 10 years, this was going to become of the utmost importance. Well, 48 months ago, almost 10 years to the day, the Vatican abruptly calls for an astrobiology study week. They called for astronomers around the world, for physicists, and particle physicists, and, these guys that study in quantum and theoretical physics, to come to the Vatican together with theologians to, guess what, ask this one question: what is the impact on faith going to be? What is the impact on religion going to be?
Which has been something they've all been concerned about for years.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Given the discovery
Lucifer is an acronym for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. I know that sounds a little forced, but that's really what it stands for. That's an acronym, and as far as we can tell, it was the Max Planck Institute in Germany that really pushed for that name, and it really goes down to a name of a politician in Germany whose name literally means devil in German, and they wanted to honor him, so they named it the Lucifer device. That's the best explanation I've been able to find on that.
Jeez. Well, I've got to tell you, the fact that they came up with that kind of acronym, is that a slap in the face to the Vatican, Chris?
That's what I originally thought. I thought maybe some of the atheist scientists or something like that were having a go at the Jesuits because they were the next door neighbors, and they just named it that to kind of play with them or something. But no, it really looks like it was done for this German politician. I think his name is I can't remember the German name for devil right now off the top of my head, but his name literally translates to devil in English, and he got the funding for the Max Planck Institute to get involved in this $33 million project known as the Large Binocular Telescope.
All right, now so let's talk a little bit about the work you two did out there and where this is leading, because of course the title of your book, On the Path of the Immortals, brings up the question, Tom and Chris, who are the immortals?
Well, that would be one of my favorite questions. And it kind of starts from a pet peeve that I have with theology and some of the systematic theology textbooks. We have this whole subject area called angelology, where we're studying these other divine beings that aren't God, they're created beings. But the problem is the term angel is really kind of a misnomer. It stems from the Greek word in the New Testament, angelos, which means messenger, and it really can be a human or a divine being, and it's not always clear. But like when you see the guys that were at Jesus' tomb and they say, Jesus isn't here, he's risen, and they're like a shining human being, that's a messenger angel. That's an angelos. And, it seems that God uses those guys to communicate messages to humanity, and they look, pretty human, and people are comfortable seeing them. They're not really too afraid of them. They do notice that they're different, but they do have a humanity about them. Now, what the problem is that there's all these other beings described in the Old Testament, especially like seraphim, which are actually serpentine or reptilian beings with 6 wings. Okay, and these fly around the throne room of God. They're probably pretty scary looking. The cherubim, another fearsome-looking creature with 4 faces even. And so these aren't the kind of things that are messengers. So it's terribly imprecise to call them angels. And so I thought that immortals was a much more apt term because it says that God created them not to die, so they don't die.
Now, the indigenous people in this area, tell me about them. I mean, because you've learned a lot of things about a lot of people who lived in this area, right? The Navajo Indian people, Apaches. Tell me about all of this, Tom.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When we got done up there on the top of Mount Graham, what happened was we came down off the mountain. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves, right? We went up, we conquered, we got everything. We actually got more than we thought we were going to get. We come down, and we send this book, Exo-Vaticana, off to the typesetter. We're feeling groovy. We're out there doing radio with guys like George Norrie, and all of a sudden, I get an email. Somebody had heard me on the radio, might have even been on Coast to Coast, but they had heard me, and I had said that the reason why the Apache Nation had joined the environmentalists in Arizona to file a federal lawsuit, actually, to try to stop the Vatican and NASA from going up onto the top of Mount Graham to build that observatory up there. That's the reason why Art Bell phrased it the way he did when he said, Father Malachi, why did they force themselves on the top of the mountain? The whole federal lawsuit, we write about all that. But anyway, I had said that the reason I thought the Apache joined the environmentalists is because the mountain was for them something like sacred ground, right? Like they were here ahead of the rest of us. Their forefathers and foremothers had lived and died on that mountain, and therefore it was kind of like something like a graveyard. And I brought that up on one of these radio shows. Well, then, like the next day, I get an email from a member of the Apache Nation, and he says, Tom, love you, brother, but you have really missed the point on this. And he goes to tell me, and I vetted this information to make sure it was correct. He goes on to tell me, he said, one of the main reasons that we filed a federal lawsuit against the Vatican and against NASA and against the Arizona State University to stop them going up there is because Mount Graham, he said, in particular, that mountain is one of the 4 holiest mountains for all American indigenous peoples in all of the world. And he said it is one of the 4 holiest mountains because it is for us what you would call in your modern terminology a stargate, a doorway, a portal, a sacred geographical mountainous location where entities have entered into and exited from Earth since the dawn of time. Well, I got to tell you, George, when I got that email, first of all, the first thing I did was I went and verified, the Apache creation mythos, their belief about that mountain and all that. I went and made sure that was true, that I wasn't being played. But once I was able to verify that that was a fact, the conspiracy meter in my head went into the red zone, man, about why in the world of all mountains would the Vatican and NASA, why would they have been willing to go into a federal court and fight? Why not just go to another mountain? There'd have been all kinds of states and places that would have gave you a mountain with the same elevation, the same environmental situation.
Without the hassles.
Without all that. So why go through this giant hassle? And the fact that the Vatican has an obvious interest, maybe later in the show we can talk about this too, where Chris went into Sedona. And what does he find? But the Vatican had gone there a long time before any of the so-called New Agers had went there and had built a church into the side of the mountain there. Yeah. So they seem to have, and our mutual friend Steve Quayle, and Timothy Alberino. They're over there in Peru right now, and they're finding this very strong presence of the Roman Catholic Church in all of the areas where the locals say there are stargates, there are doorways, there are portals, there are places on the earth where things move in and out of the dimensions. We use these terms, and sometimes it sounds Star Trek-ish or something. We use terms like Stargate or portal. All we're saying is a certain location where whatever, the veil is thinner, something is different there.
So let's get back to these other dimensions and what you think might be out here, these portals. My question was, can you see the openings? What does it look like?
I think what I would have Chris do is tell you what happened to him when he went to Sedona, because we had been told. Yeah, we had been told that the veil is getting thinner, that activity there is getting more and more prevalent. And so we sent 2 film crews. I went with one to the Four Corners area, and I can tell you what happened up there. But Chris went into the Sedona area.
All right, Chris, pick it up from there. What happened?
Okay, yeah, well, the way that I went about looking for a portal area, now, some people actually do describe seeing some sort of event horizon or a lensing type effect like you're talking about. Linda Bradshaw had witnessed one over the Bradshaw Ranch near Sedona, which is where I ended up going. And she actually has photos in her book that almost look like it's a television screen or something coming through. And then she really described that as a window into this parallel world that she thought things were coming through from. Now, what I was looking for a portal area are like small, defined locations where unexplained activity really seems to be centered. And this area in Sedona really had met all the qualifications. I studied John Keel's work quite a bit, and one of the things that he correlated to these portal areas was high levels of geomagnetic anomalies. And Sedona is literally off the chart when you look at the National Geomagnetic Anomaly map. It's so pink that it's unbelievable. It just stands out as one of the most anomalous areas on the map. And so that was kind of encouraging. And what I discovered out there really kind of flabbergasted me, George. I had never really been much of a believer in these orb photographs that are so popular on the Internet. I always thought they were dust particles or moisture, camera anomalies, reflections inside of cheap cameras. But we actually took 2 high-quality cameras, one shooting video and the other doing still, and caught orbs in all kinds of different positions, and even got one on video that kind of moves and then takes an evasive turn and kind of fades away, like it's just kind of fading from existence. And that might be it actually going through the portal. I don't know for sure, but that's available for viewers to look at on the Path of the Immortals Facebook page. It's just available for free right there on Facebook if you want to look at that short clip.
What is it about that region that has this occur, and are there other spots on this planet that are similar?
I would say definitely there are. We listed many in the book, and you have to be familiar with them from doing Coast to Coast.
Sure.
The Skinwalker Ranch, right? The San Luis Valley. These places, the Bermuda Triangle, the famous vile vortices that Ivan Anderson, the ufologist, proposed, where there's actually 10 of those. And then the Yakima Indian Reservation is famous for ghost lights and all kinds of phenomena. Big Thicket, Texas. The Devil's Triangle over in Asia. The Bennington Triangle over Vermont. The Giant Serpent Mound is known to have some activity. And, of course, John Keel documented all the events over Point Pleasant, West Virginia, when the Mothman was sighted there. And that portal actually seems to have closed. When the Silver Bridge collapsed, it seems like the activity ceased. So that kind of leads us to conclude that some of these portal areas might actually move around and change location. But others do seem to be kind of bound to the environment. And like Sedona, with those beautiful red rock formations and the high magnetic anomalies, it really does seem to be connected to that volcanic rock and that whole, just the geology of the area.
What do you think the Vatican knew about that area?
That area is spiritually charged, and this is what the New Agers were responding to in the 80s, and the Vatican saw this too. It's just a really beautiful area, for one, but there really is some kind of buzz in the air when you're there. I really experienced that, and so the Vatican built the Chapel of the Holy Cross right into the side of the mountain overlooking the city of Sedona in the 1950s, so they were there a few decades ahead of the New Age movement. During the New Age movement, a psychic medium named Paige Bryant channeled an entity named Albion and named what she called 4 vortex spots. And these are like Bell Rock and Boynton Canyon, Mystic Vista, and places like that have these names. And these are where people go to meditate, and they feel like there's a vortex energy is the way they describe it. It comes up, through these energy spots in the earth. So there's all kinds of lore and mysticism developed about the whole area and these vortex areas.
Tom, let's move over to you for a second here, because when you were in that region, tell me about your meeting with a medicine man and what happened.
Yeah, I will. And one of the things that Cris forgot to say is that while he was there, not only did he go to the area where they said the portals are, set up cameras from 2 different angles. These are professional camera people, too, from 2 different angles, and catch this light being that comes up out of this thing and is shooting about around their head evasively. You have the trailer for this book on the front of Coast to Coast AM this evening. People can click on that trailer and they'll see a little blip of that thing that is shooting around their head there. They can watch that right on Coast to Coast AM. But the thing that Cris forgot to mention is that while they were doing that, they were also shooting film up in the sky, and they didn't even realize till they got back and played the video back that a gigantic, silent, V-shaped craft. And the reason we know it's giant is because there's a tree that is standing right behind Cris that allows you to get some kind of perspective on how big this thing is. It literally was reminiscent of the Arizona Lights, and this thing is hovering in the air right above them. So they were picking up all kinds of anomalous, strange, unexplainable phenomenon that was happening there all at one time, just as people in the area had told us that we would find there. One of the other things that I should bring up, because I can tell you that, a lot of people follow me and Cris. The book's been a #1 selling book in its category for a month before it's released. Lots of people out there that follow us. We've been doing television, all kinds of stuff. But, we are mostly followed by people who want to know, okay, so what? So the American Indians believe that there are strategic locations, or the New Age movement people do, or whatever. If this don't line up with the Bible, then they don't want to believe it. Here's what we would say to them is, among all the other records around the world, including the American Indians, this absolutely is a phenomenon that is displayed in the Scripture. This idea that there are sacred geographical locations that are areas where angelic, if you want to call them that, or demonic, or whatever, move in and out of these realities. For instance, recall how when Moses is going to meet with God, he has to go to the top of Mount Sinai, and it is there where he meets with God. Recall how the Bible, when it talks about Jesus returning to the earth, it says first his feet are going to touch the top of the Mount of Olives, and it is from there that he's going to descend down. In the book of Enoch, the ancient book of Enoch, it describes the 200 powerful watchers that come down onto the top of Mount Hermon, and from there they descend down into the valley of the plain. The Greeks, years later, create these mystical doorways at the base of Mount Hermon in Caesarea Philippi, and they put the god Pan in there. There was a mask, actually, about him. You guys ran it on Coast to Coast not long ago, a mask to Pan that was found in that area. But they built these gateways into the side of the mountain, and it's right there where Jesus, years later, is standing with his disciples, and he says, the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. But then Jesus goes on to talk about Jonah and how Jonah went down into the belly of the earth. But read that ancient story, and it says he got swallowed by a fish. He goes down into the bottom of the sea, and here's what many people miss. In the Hebrew there it says he goes to Baravak, which literally translates as a city of gates, under the sea. So he goes to a place, a city of gates. He goes through these gates. He winds up in the ancient Hades, Sheol Hades. And so, anyway, but those illustrations go on and on. Number 16 talks about the gate of the earth opening up and swallowing people alive. Genesis 28, Jacob sees a ladder that is, angels are ascending and descending, and people say that the next day he dedicated that area and called it the house of God. That's not what he did. Go and read the text. It says that he said there is a gate here to the house of God. And then, of course, The one that really always gets me, George, is the Tower of Babel, because this goes into ancient Babylon.
Right.
And they were going to build a tower, right? And our mutual friend Stan Deo has talked about this ancient stele that shows the Tower of Babel with something that looks like a stargate on the top of it. This was some kind of high angelic technology. And they're going to build a tower, and the top of it, it says in the Hebrew Bible, is going to penetrate Shamayim, the dwelling place of God, the dwelling place of the watcher angels. And God says among the council of the gods, he says, they will accomplish what they have imagined to do. And what did they imagine to do? To open a doorway, a gateway. In fact, the Sumerians called the Tower of Babel Edamananki, which means the gate to God. And of course, as Cris Putnam writes in On the Path of the Immortals, the original Hebrew language, Aramaic language, about the Tower of Babel also carries this thought that there is a gate here. So we go into a whole lot of that in this new book On the Path of the Immortals for those people that want to know that this is something that has a biblical premise. There is a lot, and it's redundant in the Scripture about, and often related to mountainous locations, just like the Apache said about Mount Graham, that this is a sacred location. It is an ancient location through which things have moved in and out of this reality since the dawn of time. So, now, when I went to the Four Corners, so here's Chris. He's over there in Sedona. He's catching all kinds of anomalous activity. And we're giving this away. We're giving away a 2.5-hour special investigative report that was produced through Skywatch TV, and we're giving it away with the book On the Path of the Immortals over there. And people will get that exclusive footage. They'll see images of the V-shaped craft. They'll see this light thing, whatever in the heck it is, that's coming up through this doorway. They'll get all of that. And
let me ask you this, Tom. If you walk by these doorways, could you just kind of like stumble into them?
Now, here's this question. And I'm being careful with this answer because, I don't want to be fantastic in my answer. But when I went to the Four Corners area, and just so people know this, by the way, as a white dude, right, a non-member of the Navajo tribe, you don't get to sit down with these people. The Hopi won't even talk to you. If you get any of the tribes to talk with you, they won't allow you to even make hand notes, let alone put them on camera. So the fact that we got the third-generation Navajo oral historian, this guy is an academic. He's wrote books that are used in the Navajo schools and universities. Dr. Don Mose Jr. The fact that we got him to meet us at one of the schools, and we went into a traditional hogan and sat there and put him on film for 3 hours, telling us all of the ancient stories, all of the facts, separating the facts from the fiction in their belief system, and even telling it to us both in English and in the Navajo tongue, even singing to us in the Navajo. This is absolutely amazing. And again, if people watch that trailer on the front of Coast to Coast AM this evening, they'll see a little blip of Dr. Mose in there. He's an oral historian, so he's drawing on the ground with his finger. But when we went to, and there's so much I could tell you about it.
And let me tell people where the Four Corners are, in case they don't know it. It's where Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah all connect.
That's right. And in the Four Corners area, it's famous because there's literally hundreds. There's something like 700 cliff dwellings that are up inside the cliffs. There's also other, ancient remains there from, a pre-Pueblo Indian inhabitant of early America that people call the Anasazi. And if you look up the name Anasazi on the internet, you'll see different scholars giving it different translations. Some say it means the old ones. Some say it means the ancient ones. But some say it means an ancient alien enemy. So one of the first questions I had on my whole list of questions for Dr. Don Mose when we sit down with him was, look, I've went to, these are actually Navajo scholars that are giving these different translations. I don't understand. What does it actually really mean? And he said, well, they're all coming at it from a different angle because it depends on how you enunciate the word Anasazi. in the original Navajo tongue. So he gives us all three enunciations, and all three of them mean each one of those things, depending on how it's enunciated. And, of course, they don't know how it was originally enunciated. But if it was enunciated a certain way, then it literally does mean an ancient alien enemy. And, of course, a lot of their stories of the hero Indians that fought the giants. In fact, he published a book he gave me a copy of, and he had an artist depict some of the size of some of the giants in early America. And we're talking giants that were, as much as 200 feet tall, but a lot of them that were 30 and 40 feet tall. And this is actually taught in the Navajo schools. So we sat down, we talked with him, but here's the point I wanted to make. I asked, so he starts telling, the typical story that you might hear in a public school here in the U.S., where many years ago the pre-Pueblo Indians, the Anasazi, they're living there in the Four Corners area, and a drought comes along, like a 7-year drought, and so the waters are drying up and they can't raise their foods, and so they migrate away, and they eventually become what are today the Hopi and so on.
Oh, really? Okay.
So he's telling that story, but here's what happened, and I have this on camera. I stopped him and I said, but Dr. Mose, I've heard that there's a lot of issues with that theory, and it might not be true. For instance, when the early archaeologists went up into those cave dwellings and started, going through and finding what was in the caves, they found that everything that was necessary for life was left behind. Bags of salt would have been like gold. I mean, they literally did trade it as currency. The American Indians didn't have oceans. To get salt for them was very difficult, and they used it for preserving food and all this stuff. This was literally like leaving bags of gold behind, but that was left behind. Their weapons were left behind. Their clothing was left. Everything's left behind, and it's still just up inside the cliff dwellings, and the Anasazi are gone. So I asked him, I said, what do you do with these big issues? And we have him on film where he literally stops and he looks up into the camera and he says this. He says, well, I should not tell you this, but, and then George, he starts saying, he says, if you would have asked my great-grandfather that question, here's what he would have said. And he starts describing a portal that opened in the Four Corners area, and a reptilian deceiver comes through this portal and starts teaching the ancient Anasazi what the Bible might call pharmakia, but how to use drugs and potions and witchcraft and sorcery for opening doorways. And he said they went down into their kivas, which should be holy places, right? They go down into their kivas, and in the middle of the kiva is what the Hopi call the sipapu. This is the doorway to a parallel universe, to an underworld universe. And he said they start opening the doorway, and giants start coming up, and the giants start erupting. They're literally volcanoing, if that's a word. They're erupting up out of the earth onto the surface of the earth, and once it starts happening, it can't be stopped. And these giants start cannibalizing and destroying the Anasazi, and that is how they got wiped out. This reptilian being that came through. Now, this again is something.
Sounds like the devil, doesn't it?
Well, it does, but it might not have been the devil. It might have been what the Bible calls the fiery flying seraphim. This idea that in the days of Jared, the book of Enoch talks about the days of Jared, the watchers came down onto the earth. People look at these, they see this term watchers. They may not understand that some of those that came down in the days of Jared and taught men everything from the genetics revolution of the days of Noah to other, arts about making war, and even taught potions so that women could lure both men and angels into their beds. I mean, there's a lot going on back then. And Chris does a fabulous job in our book on the Path of the Immortals talking about the fiery flying seraphim and the fact that in appearance they are kind of human-looking, but they also have reptilian features. And that is what we found to be almost identical in terms of not just the Navajo, but the Hopi, the teachings of the Apache, the description that they gave of these beings that came through the portal were somewhat human-like, but they had the facial features of a reptile. And what's interesting about that is if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, has a portion in the Dead Sea Scrolls where it describes the leader of the Watchers who came down in the days of Jared. His name is Melcharisha. It describes him as having the facial features of a viper, of a reptile, very dark, very spooky, very scary. Well, this is exactly the same thing that Dr. Mose told us, and it wasn't just his word. After he told us about this reptile that led the Anasazi to their own destruction, he pointed out where we could travel down into the valley over there. We hired a Cherokee guide, not only to take us into the parts that are available to the public, but to take us behind locked gates onto part of the reservation where the public can't go, and showed us different things down there. But we filmed parts of the petroglyphs down there where it shows a spiral vortex, which Chris can explain, which is a universal symbol. It's in the Bible too, this spiral vortex. And out of this spiral vortex comes this reptilian being. This was all in their petroglyphs. We filmed petroglyphs that show the spiral vortex, right next to it a giant reptilian being with a halo around his head. And guess what? Right next to that, gigantic six-toed footprints in pursuit of much smaller five-toed footprints. So when you look at their petroglyphs, they absolutely correspond to the oldest oral history of the Navajo and the Hopi and the Apache. By the way, here's something interesting. So we're back to Mount Graham. The Apache, guess what their creation myth, people can go to Wikipedia and read this, their creation myth. They tell of the day when the time before time, when a giant silvery disc comes down over the top of the mountain, and in it, they say, sits the Creator, the Ancient One, and he begins creating all of the good things that are upon the earth. But soon after, the portal opens again, and they say another man, but he wasn't really a man. He was a man with the features of a viper, and so here's this dragon mythos again. He comes through. He begins. This is the Apache mythos, matches perfectly with what Mose told us about the Navajo legends and history. He comes through and he begins misguiding all of the Apache, and they start using their kivas for magic, and And then all of a sudden, the giants come through out of the earth. They come up out of the earth, and they begin sweeping across the Arizona Badlands, and they're cannibalizing these peaceful Indian farmers. And the farmers are running and they're hiding in the clefts of the mountains, and they cry out to the great God of heaven, the sun god, to deliver them. And God sends a flood that is universal, and it wipes out all of the giants. So what you find is this corroborating testimony.
It does. It comes at it in different ways, but it all says the same thing. What about the serpent in Adam and Eve? Sounds exactly what you're talking about, Tom.
It's exactly the same thing. So you have the biblical story, but you have, and here's another thing that's interesting about this, George, is that at exactly the same time in history, when Moses is in the Middle East writing the Pentateuch, saying, and there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, at exactly the same moment in history. On this side of the world, in the United States, the Anasazi building cliff dwellings as a defensive measure to try to preserve themselves from being attacked by giants and this giant reptilian. That's happening on this side of the world at the same moment that on the other side of the world Moses is saying, and there were giants in the earth in those days. They didn't have the internet in those days. So, folks, I mean, this is fabulous corresponding evidence that around the world there were global events that took place, and people on both sides of the world, from their own worldviews, from their own point of views, they were writing down these same things. In fact, Dr. Mose told us, when I said, man, it sounds to me like you are absolutely describing Old Testament theology, because he's not a Christian. Some of the Navajo elders are, but he's not. He's a Navajo. And he said, well, that's the reason why when the missionaries came to the American Indians, during the Spanish, invasion, he said, that's the reason why we told them, we already know these stories. This is already part of our history. we're already very aware. And it's actually why, evidently, it's very easy for some of the members of the indigenous people to convert to Christianity because their history identifies perfectly with the history of the Old Testament. But think about that. What that really says to us is whatever was happening in the Middle East was happening here at the same time. This invasion into the earth, the whole idea that there are gates of the earth behind which there are these immortals that Cris Putnam writes about that wait and sometimes come through. This is something that is supported by worldwide history.
Well, Tom, we have hundreds of thousands of people disappearing on this planet every year. Nobody knows where they are, where they've gone. Could they be getting swallowed up by these portals and these entities?
Absolutely could. And another thing you got to ask yourself, George, you and I did some radio programs way back when the went under George Bush, when the U.S. was invading Iraq. Mm-hmm. You and I did programs in which we were asking, why in the world are we going to Iraq? There's no good intel connecting them to what happened on 9/11. And we speculated that they were going to Iraq because that's the home of the ancient Babili. That's the home of the ancient Tower of Babel.
That's right.
The gateway to God. And that they went there to get something. I don't know, however, and again, I don't want to dominate this conversation. Chris has got a lot of stuff.
Yeah, Chris, you still with us?
Yeah, I'm having a good time listening right now.
Fascinating. Well, let me, Chris, let me ask you this, because I know you're tied into a lot of this too, but I do want to get your take on what you think the Vatican, and you addressed it, both of you, in your first work, what you think the Vatican is looking for with this telescope.
Well, I could say with certainty that, this idea of portals that we're talking about is absolutely a scientifically respectable idea these days. And, one of the number one cosmology theories right now is called brain world theory, where they think that they're parallel universes. They're like membranes that, are stacked parallel in a larger reality they call the bulk. And, Steinhardt up at Princeton is one of the principal astronomers that's working on this. Now, what he thinks a black hole is like a concentrated area of density where these two membranes actually touch. So it literally is an Einstein-Rosen bridge or a wormhole between parallel universes. And so this is a very respectable idea in astrophysics. It's not really on the edge anymore. It's pretty mainstream. Now, up on Mount Graham, the Large Binocular Telescope and the Lucifer device are confirming a recent hypothesis that all spiral galaxies, like our Milky Way, contain wormholes. Now, there's a new paper that just came out in the last few months talking about this. They even called it a galactic transport system. Now, that kind of begs the question of what's it transporting?
That's right.
This hypothesis, it's really based on dark matter, and dark matter is really, they detect all this huge gravitational force, but they can't see anything there, so they call it dark matter. Now, what they think it is possibly these parallel universes. And the thing is, the light cannot escape from that universe into our universe, so we don't see it, but gravity does. So gravitons are the only thing that we see coming. And they're actually talking about perhaps trying to communicate between parallel universes by using gravitons. And you could arrange them, in a series of ones and zeros or something like that, and send pulses of gravity or something like that is what they're thinking about as interdimensional communication. And they're absolutely talking about these ideas. So it's the Lucifer device helps astronomers look into these really areas where the dark matter is a halo in the spiral galaxy. And the Lucifer device works in the near-infrared spectrum, and it sees things that you can't see in visible light. And so it's really what they're trying to use to find black holes and possibly wormholes to other dimensions.
So we're not concerned about an asteroid coming this way or so-called wormwood, whatever that may be?
Well, that's another idea, and a lot of people connect the Vatican to that. There's been a lot of books written and theories about that, and I've seen YouTube videos where they say the Vatican is watching for Nibiru and things of that nature. I'm not aware that that's the case, but they certainly are in a position to watch for that. And, prophecy does talk about wormwood, coming down and hitting, and it does sound to me like a giant meteor or something of that nature. So, that's certainly an idea that I'm open to investigating. I'm not aware of any really solid evidence that there's another planet coming through. I know a lot of people believe that. I haven't seen enough evidence to really believe it yet. But the Vatican could be watching for something of that nature. They have a lot of prophecies about a great comet that appears right before the end times. And so a lot of Catholics are expecting to see this great comet. So that's another option.
These portals, do they close up?
George, I think that some of them do. And like the example I gave before, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, with the Mothman case that John Keel made famous. When the Silver Bridge collapsed, it was a really big tragedy. It was a huge bridge that went between Ohio and West Virginia, and there was probably 60, 70 cars on there. It was during the Christmas shopping season. And that bridge collapsed. It was a massive tragedy. A lot of people were killed. But it really seemed to be the end of a string of paranormal activity around that area. So Keel hypothesized that the portal, or as he called it, a window, it basically opened for a period of time and closed. And perhaps they move on to another area or something like that.
There's like 1,000 kind of ways this conversation can go now, but the fact that on Mount Graham, using the infrared technology there, one of the things that we learned was that infrared can see things that we might call UFOs. It can see them opening and closing, like doorways or whatever, that seem to be strange. I mean, you can go to YouTube and just type in infrared UFO. And there's actually some guys over there that have even put up side-by-side videos that show non-infrared telescopes looking into deep space, at the same time infrared Lucifer device looking into deep space. And it's amazing. On the one video, absolutely nothing in space. On the second video, man, there is crazy. Some of the craziest, weirdest, most bizarre activity going on in deep space being picked up by infrared technology. Now, at Mount Graham Observatory, they also there are looking for dark matter, dark energy, and this is something that they're also looking for at the CERN, Large Hadron Collider.
And they may be more apt to find something, I think, rather than this observatory, which is...
I think they're both working together, but you may be right. And the reason is, in fact, you can go to Forbes right now, the online website Forbes. There's an article they published about 4 or 5 days ago, 6 days ago. It's called How to Find a Parallel Universe, CERN Boosts Data Intelligence, in case somebody wants to Google that. And read about how the scientists over there are discussing, in somewhat certain terms now, their faith, that CERN is on the cusp of discovering evidence for parallel worlds. And they're looking for the gateway, the door, the stargate, if you will, the pathway to that parallel world. And actually the experiments that they're running right now, and in fact, I think, is it today, tomorrow, it's this week, it's right now that they're powering up that machine to run the most powerful experiments that have ever been conducted on this planet.
Yep, they're coming back online very soon.
They are. And I think what they think is these little particle collisions, they're doing microscopic nanoparticles, and that these actually make a rip into space-time and actually open a wormhole. And this is one of the ideas that's been thrown around at CERN, that this could happen, unexpectedly even. They could tear a tear in the fabric of reality. That's
a concern. Now, a lot of scientists I've talked to, they just push that aside. But that's a real concern, Chris.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's a scientifically respectable idea. It's not just something of science fiction. They really are. They look at the very small to develop their theories about the very large. We heard early on when they started up CERN was that they were trying to reconstruct the initial conditions of the Big Bang, which is the creation of the entire universe. And that really goes to the theory of inflation and Big Bang cosmology, where they really did discover through Einstein's equations that time and space seems to have had a beginning. And they call that point the singularity. It's like a point of infinite density. So I suppose that what they think that if they break these particles down so they can't get anything any smaller, that the smallest possible particle, I guess, would be like a Planck length, which is the distance that you really can't go any smaller because it loses locality, which is another really weird thing about quantum physics. That's why they call it quantum. It's in little steps. And once you get to this certain length, you'd think that everything could get infinitely smaller, but they found that's not true. Once you get to the Planck length and you try to go any smaller than that, it loses locality. And now, what does that mean? It just means you can't measure it anymore. So there is a length. Our universe seems to be digital rather than analog. It's like little bits.
Right.
And that's one of the ideas that leads some people to think that our reality is something of a digital simulation, or even,
or a hologram or something
like that, exactly.
And Chris, also what is mind-boggling to me, both of you, is that this all echoes stories, depending on how you interpret it, in Genesis. Everything you've talked about.
Absolutely. One of the things that I discovered, I wrote the chapter, The Science of Portals, as one of the first chapters in the book, because I wanted to ground these ideas in scientifically feasible realities. And I discovered that a wormhole, like a black hole, traditionally the gravity would destroy you before you even got near the lens of it. Well, a scientist named Roy Carr discovered that if the black hole is spinning, that if it spins at the right rate, the inertia would cancel the effects of the gravity and make it navigable. So if you were going to have a traversable black hole, it would be called a Carr black hole, and it would actually be spinning really fast.
These discoveries, clearly there's something going on in this universe, and we're finding them out. But why isn't mainstream science telling us this?
Well, they're starting to talk about it, and that's what I was mentioning in that article. I would suggest the listeners just Google galactic transport system, and you'll find an article from about 6 months ago, peer-reviewed scientific paper saying that all Milky Way galaxies, are centered on a nucleus of a wormhole, and that there could be wormholes all around, forming a galactic transport system. That's their language. Now, the thing that I found, for a black hole to be traversable, it would probably have to be rotating at a high rate of speed, as the scientist Roy Carr said, where the inertia would cancel the devastating effects of the gravity at the event horizon. What I found really fascinating is that if you look in some of the oldest ancient texts, one of the oldest stories that they're aware of is this Hebrew story of Job. And it's really kind of an odd story where you kind of get a peek behind the curtains of the heavenlies, where it's like Satan and God are having a contest to see, if Job will remain faithful, and Satan is torturing him basically, and Job doesn't really recant his faith. But at the end, when God speaks to Job, it says that he spoke out of a whirlwind. Now, that kind of caught my eye, and I started looking through the Hebrew ancient text and discovered that Elijah, he was taken up to heaven, it says, in a whirlwind.
That's right.
And is that just an accident? I don't know, but it sounds like what you would expect an ancient person to describe if they saw something like a wormhole, and it was a rotating black hole appeared, and he kind of got sucked up into that. That's kind of what you would expect them to describe it as, wouldn't you not?
I like that. And Tom, scientists are telling us that there could be another planet or another type of world underneath our crust. What's that all about?
Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic. Let me connect these two things. What Chris is talking about, and this is partly what CERN is looking for, these traversable wormholes. Right now, they're over there. And I think today, tomorrow, the next day. It's right now. They're powering up to the most powerful experiments that have ever happened. They're going to collide protons at nearly the speed of light, 600 million collisions per second. They've got these 4 particle detectors. They're going to film these particles as they break apart into their subatomic parts. They're looking for quarks, gluon, but they're looking for what Chris was saying. They're also, and this primarily actually, they're looking for gravitons. Why? Because gravitons, if that particle, which they believe exists, if that's the particle that makes up gravity, gravity is the weak energy, they believe that it escapes into parallel realities. Why? Well, some of the early experiments that they did at CERN, where they collided these particles, they think what were gravitons essentially disappeared as the particle detectors were filming those break-aparts. Something went away. The particles went away. They went somewhere. They're not sure where they went. They're pretty sure they went into a parallel reality. Now, I want to recommend that people go to YouTube, look up a Brian Greene documentary that's called The Theory of Everything.
He's a good guy. He's been on the show many times.
He produced a documentary, The Theory of Everything, documentary on string theory. Fast forward to 33 minutes in that documentary and watch how the people that he's interviewing, some of these are physicists from CERN, watch how they start talking about gravitons and how gravitons might be escaping into a parallel reality. And if they are, then gravitons, like Chris was saying earlier, might be the methodology. We could use them. We could put them together in strings of ones and zeros. We could send messages into a parallel world where it might be received, and maybe they would send a message back. And that is exactly why Sergio Bertolucci, who is the director there at CERN, said, we're going to open a doorway, and we might send something through it, or something might come back. That's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to verify what Chris and I have been talking, this whole idea, spinning vortexes, parallel realities, doorways that open and close. This is something that has existed since the beginning of time, but now theoretical physicists also believe in it. Okay, now to get to your statement about the Earth. And here's something that's interesting. You know, George, how just a few months ago and even today, people around the world writing articles, giving testimony, even MSNBC ran some articles on this, talking about strange sounds that are being heard
hums
around the world. A hum that is coming up out of the Earth. Other people describing it as like the clanking of metal against each other. I forwarded one of those articles recently to one of the world's smartest, most well-known scholars. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want him to get inundated with emails tonight. But I said, what do you think's going on? Guess what he emails me back? He emails me back and he says, Tom, they're busy down there, aren't they? Those pesky subterranean dwellers. He said they must know something's up. The word's out. They're soon going to be released to the surface of the Earth again, like they were in those days when the Anasazi and Moses on the other side of the world was talking about their appearance. So he sends me that email. Just a few days later, NASA and the European Association of Geochemistry, they publish a research by a team of Harvard scientists who now are confirming evidence that there's something going on beneath the crust of this Earth. They published scientific evidence that there is remnants of something going on beneath the surface of the Earth, and they're dating it back actually to a time when they think something impacted the Earth. So get this, they're saying something fell to the Earth, something hit the Earth.
Which also may have made the moon.
That made the moon. That's exactly right. That's what they said. But was this the fall of Lucifer? Because remember, Jesus says that the fall of Lucifer was like a star falling from heaven, impacting the Earth. But in whichever case a person wants to interpret that, something collided with the Earth, produced the moon. But they say remnants of that original Earth. Now, we're going, back a long time ago, 4.5 billion years ago, according to scientists. Remnants of that original Earth, they say, was pushed down into the subsurface area of the Earth. The rest of the Earth kind of, covered over the top of it. And they're picking up isotopic signals of something beneath the Earth, 4.5 billion years old. Now, that came like a week after scientists said that they now have concrete evidence, that's their term, not mine, of a subsurface ocean that they say is 3 times bigger than all of the surface oceans combined. And I read a scientific article a few days ago talking about if that's true, then might there be life inside of it? So you have teams of scientists that believe that they're right now picking up unexplained isotopic ratios from deep within the Earth that could be a signal from material from before the Earth collided with another planet-sized body. These are an echo of an ancient Earth that existed 4.5 billion years ago. And the theory, of course, goes along with what you just said. This is a time when something hit the Earth, created the moon, and they think this might have even been something that had the mass the size of Mars. So we're talking about something really large. In fact, they dubbed it Thea, which is interesting because that's the ancient goddess and female equivalent of Lucifer, the female light bearer, the shining one. Something very large, they call it Thea, that hit the Earth. This collision generated enough power that it could have melted the whole planet. Thankfully, it only sideswiped us or something like that, according to the theory. And so instead of the whole Earth melting, part of it hit one hemisphere, the other hemisphere remained normal, and it pushed it beneath the surface of the Earth. And the geochemistry of the Earth now is indicating those differences. They call it noble gas isotope ratios, different parts of the Earth. You know, we often talk about the half-life of nuclear radiation.
Right.
That's what they're talking about, that there is something that's 4.5 billion years old, but it's echoing up out beneath the surface of the Earth. So now, you know, does this go to inner Earth theory or hollow Earth theory? The idea that something very disruptive happened, but something continues to exist beneath the surface of the Earth, where there's oceans, where there's maybe even life. If you believe the ancient records, the fact that the Earth is like a holding tank, that's what all the ancient records, including the Bible, but even non-biblical texts, talk about the Earth as the location for paradise, Sheol, Hades, a subterranean reality, but it also discusses gateways between that reality and ours that sometimes can be open. And that's kind of where Cris Putnam and I are coming in this work on the path of the immortals.
And Chris and Tom, do you two, even though you've come up with specific theories in your books, do you both agree on them, or is there a little disagreement every once in a while?
I think we agree on most of these points. We pretty much have the same worldview. We do kind of filter a lot of this through the lens of the ancient texts of Scripture, of the Bible. We're unashamed to say that we're followers of Jesus Christ, that we're Christians. But we also take a scientific look at everything too, and try to reconcile those in a way that makes sense and takes both of those areas of study seriously. And you find records all throughout the ancient world of an underworld. The Greeks had Tartarus, and it was always kind of a scientifically respectable idea as well. Their philosophers like Anaxagoras in the 5th century, talked about an underworld, and then theories about a hollow space inside the Earth. I think it was a Soviet researcher who first proposed that the Earth was hit by a meteorite or something of that nature and knocked a big hunk out of it. I think his name was Observatory, a hypothesis about the meteorite hitting the Earth in primeval times. And, he thought that it crushed the crust and made the moon, like you guys were saying. But it also would create perhaps some hollow space. And what Tom is talking about is when we look at these ancient prophecies, we see things like portals to the underworld opening up. In the book of Revelation, at the 5th trumpet judgment, the portal to the abyss is opened, and genetic monstrosities that are described as locust-like things that have stingers that can actually torture people for a period of time. It's just amazing to read these horrific beings flying up out of the underworld. And, this sounds like there really is a storage area. There's 4 fallen angels that come out from under a rock, it sounds like, in the river Euphrates. It sounds like they're just being held there for a certain period of time. And then in the Septuagint version of the Bible, we discover in Isaiah chapter 13 that it speaks of gates opening and giants coming through to fulfill the wrath of God during the end times. Now, that's a really chilling piece of prophecy there.
Were the giants
Were
the giants the Nephilim?
That's right. It really is the return of the Nephilim in Isaiah chapter 13 in the Greek version of that text. The Masoretic Hebrew text doesn't include that. But it's interesting. The more ancient copies that we have are the Greek versions, and they do say giants are coming to fill my wrath. And at the end of that destruction, it's really kind of chilling because it describes this area of Babylon only be inhabited by monsters and demons. And it says that there will be these satyrs, which are these half-goat, half-human beings like Pan. Another translation calls them donkey centaurs. So you see like these mythological beings that have been associated throughout time with these kind of portal areas. And that's what I find really interesting is that even in modern accounts and accounts by secular people, when you go to these portals like Skinwalker Ranch or somewhere, you see monsters there, you see UFOs there, you see strange beings. It's the same thing that you see in Isaiah chapter 13. They have these demon beings and monsters and donkey centaurs and things wandering around. I don't think that's an accident. I think this is characteristic of these genuine portal areas where the veil is thinner between our reality and this supernatural realm.
Is this just happening on this planet, or do you think it's all over the universe?
That's a good question, and that's not one that I can answer because I just don't have any other knowledge of any planet other than this one, George.
Tom, you were going to chime in on that.
Oh, I was. I think that's actually a dynamic question that arises. If you look at, like on the Earth, you have all these megalithic structures, the Great Pyramid, the Baalbek, and those kind of things. And this question, if those were built by the Watchers, as we concluded they were, would the Watchers also have built similar structures on other planets that perhaps were under their jurisdiction before this great war, between God and Lucifer? And there's a lot of places that are also in Scripture that I think kind of echo, like the 28th chapter of Ezekiel, where the proud angel is called the anointed cherub that covereth, who was upon the holy mountain of God, it says, and it says he walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. And but because of his rebellion, God declares, I will cast thee as profound out of the mountain of God, and I will destroy the old covering cherub from the midst of the stones of fire. Well, those stones of fire are believed by a lot of scholars to represent the planetary belt. And it's not unreasonable, I think, to imagine that Lucifer and his angels, or put some other name on them if you want to, who once held command over certain of the planetoids, that they would have built artificial structures on them. My very good friend David Flynn, before he died, he wrote a book called Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars. David really believed that the day would come when we would, we were going to send spaceships or whatever up there, that the world would finally admit that there were structures.
That could happen. That could happen sooner than later, Tom.
Absolutely could happen, and I'll tell you something else. We've been talking about the Vatican, and while they're the biggest duck in the puddle with upcoming responsibility for controlling the flow of disclosure information for the world's religious communities.
Of everything you've been researching over the past 5-10 years, this one seems to be something that really has captured your attention. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, it actually kind of shocked me because, I've lived here in the United States my whole life, grew up here. I'm very familiar with the Four Corners area, the Anasazi, the whole thing. But it wasn't until I came down off of Mount Graham that the light just kind of went on in my head when I got contacted by a member of the Apache Nation who said, you've really missed the point. The reason why we filed a federal lawsuit against the Vatican and NASA is because Mount Graham is for us what you, in your worldview, might call a doorway, a gateway, a portal. And the idea, because, as a student of biblical history, I always tend to kind of put all this stuff in the Middle East because, that's the origins of the Old Testament. But to start thinking about the very place where I grew up, and to realize that the history that we have in this country, which is so rich, is a testament there are records here, and they date to the exact moment in time that the same phenomenon was going on in the Middle East. That was just a really eye-opening, actually kind of a very cool experience for me to realize that we had this testimonial that is fairly concrete, the same story. Now here, of course, you know, they wrote it down in petroglyphs. In the Middle East, they wrote it down on animal skins, but they all told exactly the same story, and they said this happened at the same time. Gateways of the earth opened up. Giants came up out of the earth. And so it's interesting that these records tell us that the earth itself is dynamic. You know, the average person listening to this program tonight, get in their car tomorrow and drive to Walmart, don't really stop and think that the crust that they're driving over, as far as the ancient records universally are concerned, is a shell under which there is a very dynamic reality, and there are very intelligent entities that are beneath the earth. And not only did once before the Sipapu of the American Indians or the gateways of the biblical narrative open and these things came up out of the earth, there's prophecies that say it's going to happen again. And actually, I think this is probably the most overlooked aspect of end times biblical prophecy, is that the earth is dynamic and gates of the earth are going to open. Chris, in the previous hour, quoting from, you know, the book of Isaiah chapter 13, where it says, "Open the gates, ye ruler, I give command." Giants are coming to fulfill my wrath.
And they might. Let's take some calls here, Tom. We don't have a lot of time with you, so let us go to Travis in Johnson City, Tennessee, on the wild card line. You're on with Tom Horn. Go ahead, Travis.
In Revelation, when God opens one of the seals, it says, and John of Patmos says that he saw an angel hurl a fiery mountain into the sea. And I've always taken that as meaning an asteroid or a meteor. And I wonder if that's what possibly the Vatican could be watching that's approaching. And even if our government or the Vatican did know that a meteor was headed our way, would they tell us? And also, do you think that if that is possible, does that have something to do with all the FEMA camps that are popping up in the United States?
It's a very interesting question, and I have to admit I've had a lot of the same suspicions. The text that you're talking about out of the Bible, this object, wormwood, that falls from heaven, it strikes the sea, it poisons a great deal of the waters of the earth, and isn't it interesting how it almost seems like all of a sudden we have this international effort by both NASA and other global powers to come up with some kind of an asteroid defense system. Do they know something that we do not know? Are they just being careful because, you know, as technology advances, we become more aware of near-Earth orbiting objects that could strike the Earth? I think actually today or tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow actually, that there is an asteroid that's going to come very close to the Earth. Is it just because, you know, as our ability has advanced, we've become more aware of these close to Earth orbiting objects?
And that's happening just in a few hours, sometime Thursday.
Yeah, or is it we know something? And a lot of Catholic scholars, you know, kind of played off of what Malachi Martin said years ago when he said something's, you know, approaching the Earth. It's going to be of the utmost importance within about 10 years. And they've kind of connected that to a Catholic prophecy that talks about an asteroid that might come close to the Earth or hit the Earth that's essentially taken out of the book of Revelation. So I've had a lot of the same questions. You know, are we just being careful because our technology has advanced to the point that we know we need to come up with an, you know, like the movie Armageddon? We need to come up with some defense plan to nuke an asteroid if it's en route.
If we have to, yeah.
Or is it not just being, you know, precautious? Maybe we know something is approaching the Earth, and we haven't yet disclosed that to the rest of us. But we're trying to come up with some kind of defensive method for diverting it if possible.
Well, let's go to Michael in Virginia Beach, Virginia, east of the Rockies. Hi, Michael. Go ahead.
Tom Horn, in Deuteronomy 12, the second verse, Moses orders the Israelites that they are to destroy completely, I'm quoting now, all the places on the high mountains where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Then in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy, starting at about verse 43, he tells what will happen if they don't do that. He says, foreigners who reside among you will rise above you higher and higher. And skipping down a little bit, he says, they will destroy you completely if you don't destroy their places of worship. Now, on this show, on April 26th last year, we had Henry Cooper of the Shark Hunters tell us about Hitler's children going into southwestern United States. We also, in May of 2011, we had Jim Mars on this show, in which during the call-in portion, I called in, and we talked about the fact that the Vatican had a war pact with Hitler. Now, the Vatican never surrendered. So we have our enemy on our high places worshiping these demon gods, and we can't protect our borders. We can't balance our budgets. We got the Cuban communists coming in from this patsy for the Vatican in the White House. What do you have to say about that?
That's a lot to say, Tom. That's a lot to say.
Yeah, that's a lot to try to respond to. Here's the thing. This is an interesting year, 2015. You have the Pope Francis, who, according to the 900-year-old prophecy of the popes, is the last pope who is going to reside. He's going to sit on the throne of Peter as the church in the world enters into the Great Tribulation period. Is that going to happen? We're just going to wait and see. But this pope is going to speak before the United Nations this year as a first. He's going to speak to a joint session of the United States Congress as a first. He's issuing an encyclical on environmentalism, and today actually came out and said that he, supported the Palestinian cause against the Jewish claim to covenant land in Israel. So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole lot of stuff that we're watching right now, and much of it. I was interviewed by WorldNet Daily today wanting to know what I thought about, Pope Francis's position on the Palestinian state. So there's a whole lot of stuff right now that especially conservative Christians, evangelicals for the most part, are going to have to watch and just see what happens and how is it going to play out in terms of world events. And is it the fulfillment of end times biblical prophecy? It certainly could be. We're all watching it together to see. Other than that, I'm not exactly sure what the caller was asking for, but hopefully I maybe answered a question.
Let's go to Leo in Albuquerque, New Mexico, west of the Rockies. Leo, you're up with us. Go ahead, sir.
I was fascinated to learn by a guest on one of your past programs not too often long ago. I can't remember who it was specifically, but I believe that they said that the translation of Cairo, the word Cairo is in Egypt. Mars, exactly. In Arabic equals Mars. I think that's just fascinating. Richard C. lives here, of course, and I've been following him for years, and I'm in total agreement that there are ruins on Mars, and probably the moon, too. And I believe it was Ed Dames who made the comment that we will not be allowed by these watchers, if you will, to ever engage in a nuclear slugfest, as it were, and the problem with when we were doing a lot of nuclear testing and exploding these atomic bombs in the atmosphere, the problem is it's ripping a hole in the fabric of space-time and therefore we are messing with other people's worlds, if you will. Just thought I'd try and get your response to that.
Well, it's possible.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. I mean, so a couple of different things you mentioned. You know, we're ripping a hole in the fabric of space-time is one thing. The first thing was the possibility of artificial structures on Mars. Again, this was something that my very good friend, he's deceased now, David Flynn, I published his book, Temple at the Center of Time. Steve Quayle published his book, Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars. And then I finally published the David Flynn collection that had not only those things but articles that he had written. He was convinced, and, you know, he went out with Hoagland, and they went to different places and put on these big events and gave presentations. He was convinced that the United States intelligence communities were already aware that there was artificial structures on Mars. It was actually a movie that was kind of based on that idea that was made that Disney produced, and Hoagland at the time came up with some information that showed that Disney was kind of just really playing off of what the intelligence communities in the U.S. already knew, that there were edifices that were built on other worlds, including Mars, evidently, similar to edifices that were built here on the Earth. And so, you know, there's indications all around the world today that there are structures, circular mazes, altars, mounds that are related to the Watchers and their giant offspring that appear to serve the purpose of the Earth at one time having been in contact with other worlds, other beings. For instance, in the Golan Heights, there's the huge Stonehenge-like monument that archaeologists believe to be as much as 5,000 years old. It's called the Gilgal Raphaim. In the next 30 minutes, you'll have Cris Putnam on. You could ask him about that because he wrote about it in our book On the Path of the Immortals. But this whole circle of the Raphaim is from a time we don't even quite understand, but we know all the language around it connects it to the Nephilim, but it also connects it to demons, ghosts, hauntings, the shades of the dead. It appears to have been a gateway, a doorway, a portal, so that there's things on Earth that may connect to things on other worlds, including Mars, the red planet, the war planet, that may have been a doorway, an opening, a gateway. And CERN right now is trying to prove that some of that is possible. And what I would tell people is keep in mind that CERN is located in St. Genus Powilly, which is a township in eastern France. It's on the border with Switzerland. But what a lot of people don't know is the St. Genus Powilly, this is part of the ancient Romans. The original name for that area was Apolliacum. It served as a location for the temple, but also the gateway, the doorway, the portal to Apollo, Apollyon, who's listed in the book of Revelation you was quoting as belonging to the king of those hybrid fallen angels that are beneath the surface of the earth and who is going to come up out of the earth. That's what, when I said earlier that this whole idea about doorways and gateways and portals, the most overlooked aspect of end times biblical prophecy, there in the book of Revelation 9, what happens? A king, a star, it says, descends from heaven with a key to the bottomless pit. He opens that gate of the earth, and what happens? Those demonic locusts you were talking about come up out of the earth. So the earth is a prison. It's
a prison planet.
It's got stuff in it. It's got intelligence in it. And it's connected not only to biblical prophecy, but you could go all the way back to the Maya. The Maya, and so we're not going to have time to talk about all this, but the Maya, when a lot of people were saying they were predicting the end of the world, actually what they were predicting was more interesting than that. They said following the year 2012, the gates of the earth are going to open, and Bolan Yakteku, who is guarding the bones of the giants in the underworld, is going to ascend up out of the underworld sometime between 2012 and 2016. That's way more interesting than what a lot of people were talking about the end of the world, because it's not what they said.
Cris, how did you get started into all this kind of work?
Well, George, it really started when I graduated with a master's degree in theology, and I started addressing the subject of transhumanism from a theological point of view, and I kind of hooked up with Tom because he was one of the early people talking about the transhumanism issue, and it really just kind of blossomed from a book called Pandemonium's Engine, and we ended up doing Petrus Romanus, and of course that's when we predicted the Pope would step down, and that just went crazy.
When that happened, did you freak out?
Well, I'll tell you, I was really surprised. How that story goes is even really more shocking. I mean, I discovered a book by a Jesuit named Teilhard, and this book predicted that the Pope would step down in April of 2012, back in 1950, and in print, copyrighted, and Father Thibault had done all these elaborate formulas and calculated this from so many different angles. It's just amazing. He must have invested a lot of his life into it. Well, April 2012 came and went, and Tom and I didn't see the Pope step down, and we didn't think much of it. But then in February of the following year, when he did step down, the New York Times article said that he had actually did this to a private group of insiders in April of 2012 when he got back from the South American trip. So it was actually right when Father Thibault had predicted back in 1950 is when he did it. It was the first time a pope had done that in like 500 years, so it's really kind of incredible.
Oh, it really was.
It really was, and I was really shocked to see that. I don't even know what to make of that exactly. I mean, it makes you want to take this Jesuit's work a lot more seriously, though.
Well, I'm amazed at how your work and Tom's work kind of echoes Genesis and some of the things that have happened since our creation.
Well, certainly, we take those texts seriously. We know that ancient people kind of had a pre-scientific worldview with the way they describe things, but you can often see, the scientific reality behind things. So I kind of look at it that way, like I was doing with the whirlwinds, and Isaiah and things like that. I mean, I think that could describe something like a spinning black hole, and a wormhole to a parallel universe. I don't have any problem of thinking of these otherworldly realms like the heavenlies and even the underworld as, other dimensions. I think that this is the sort of thing that science is pointing to. So if you can believe in parallel universes, you really shouldn't have a problem believing in things like heaven and hell.
That's right. Let's go to the phones now. Jason is in Greensburg, Kentucky on the wild card line. Jason, thanks for holding, sir. Go ahead.
I was wondering what you thought, what you think about the timing of it all, if you expect what you've been talking about tonight to coincide with the one world government and the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. Secondly, I was wondering if there's some of these ancient texts that mention in the creation that there was a woman named Lilith who may have been Adam's first wife, and I don't really know enough to say I have an opinion on that either, but I was going to see if you had anything to say about that.
Okay, let's look into that. First of all, one world government, the push to do this. Did you come across anything like that, Cris, in your work?
Well, if he's asking about that idea in prophecy, then it's absolutely there. And it's there in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. It really speaks of a one-world system. And so it's there very early in the Hebrew Bible. But then in the book of Revelation, it talks about, he'll be given power over every nation. And so it's very, very clearly speaking of a one-world government and a one-world economic system. The mark of the beast is right there. And John the Revelator is saying that there's going to be someone who can control whether you buy or sell. And, what decides that is if you put a mark of loyalty to him. That's really what it is. It's his mark, his name, that you have to place loyalty to, and that really determines whether you can participate in the economy. Now, back when John wrote that, that's a preposterous idea, but today there are competing technologies of how to implement something like that, and it's getting to be kind of chilling with all the tattoos and RFID chips and implantable devices where they're going to be able to track you by a satellite whether you want them to or not, it looks like.
All right, what do we know about Lilith?
Lilith. Now, My best estimate of this is it's an extra biblical tradition that developed way later, way after the original story of Adam and Eve. I don't think that it's ancient. I don't think it's true. I think it's kind of a perversion of the text, and it's kind of a polemic, really, against God's goodness in a lot of ways. So I think it's mostly a demonic device of the evil one. Now, that doesn't mean there's not an entity, Lilith. I think that that's very plausible that there is an evil entity that goes by this name.
Scary name all by itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that there's a reality, a demonic reality behind that being, but I don't think that the mythology is true. I think it's a lie. I think it's really a polemic against the goodness of God in the Garden of Eden.
Next up, we go to Jason in Cleveland, Tennessee, east of the Rockies. Hi, Jason. Go ahead.
Hey, referring to what you just said a minute ago about the mark of the beast. From what I remember, reading the Bible, the mark of the beast will be put on after rapture. Now, don't quote me on any of this, but my theory is, since there will be a mass confusion that will allow the Antichrist to control everyone, I think you said God will allow him to have a mass confusion. After rapture, that are chosen will be taken up into heaven. Now, let's say the mass confusion is, or the people that don't want to believe, let's say me and George Norrie are driving in a car or wherever. He leaves in front of my eyes, disappears, and I'm still driving my vehicle. All right, well, the part of that is I don't want to believe that Jesus took George Norrie and didn't take me. So what do we have on earth to say where all these people went? Let's just say at the most, Jesus took a third of the earth. So I'm going to say, well, Jesus didn't take him and not me. Surely I'm good enough. The next thing we're going to say is, well, aliens, as crazy as it sounds, took everyone. Then the mark of the beast comes about being able to buy a product or buy food or fuel. Well, if we lose a third of the population, we've lost doctors, lawyers, gas attendants, linemen, electrical, welders, etc. So then there would be a need to put a card or something to say, hey, from now on, you're only allowed 5 gallons of fuel a week, 1 gallon of milk, etc. And that's my topic, and I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you very much.
Well, he really brings up kind of a controversial topic in prophecy, which would be the timing of the rapture. And
which some say is going to happen. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a vigorous debate amongst believers about when that happens. What he's talking about is called the pre-tribulation rapture, and this is the idea that it could happen at any time, that it's imminent, and no one knows the day because it's just going to pop up and the church is just going to disappear. And then there's a kind of a mediated view, and this is probably where I fall. It's called the pre-wrath view, and I think that the church is going to stick around and see the Antichrist, and the reason I believe that is the book of Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. Paul says, let no one deceive you, because that day will not come unless the man of sin or the man of lawlessness appears. And so he's really warning this church in Thessalonica that they're going to see this man of lawlessness appear, and he's going to really claim to be God. And Jesus calls that the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24. So it seems to me that the church is going to be around to see that, because we are warned about it so clearly. I don't know why we would be warned about it if we weren't going to be here to see it. So that's why I fall down what they call the pre-wrath view, and this would be that the rapture would happen sometime right when the judgments start getting serious with the bowls of wrath and the trumpets and whatnot. After the seals are opened, I would put the church there. So then there's other people that have a good view they call the post-tribulation view, and they do not see the church getting pulled out until really the very end of it all. And all those views have good arguments. And so, I don't think it's something you can be really dogmatic about, even amongst sincere believers. So, there are really good arguments for all three views. But I fall down at pre-wrath.
Chris, the portals, what's the significance of the fact that they may be here?
Well, I think it was important just to know that this is, that these things are real. And that's why I wanted to go to Sedona. I'd read about it in the UFO journals, and, paranormal investigators, and it just seemed to be a place where you could almost guarantee if you make the trip out there that you're going to see something. And if you're going to go fishing, go where they're biting. And that's the one that I did some online research, and it just kept coming up over and over again. And I read a few books about it, and I think I verified that there really is something weird there. It really is a thin area of dimensional travel. Now, I didn't see all the other things that other people have seen. There's people that have seen dinosaurs there. There's people that have seen Bigfoot there, thunderbirds, pterodactyl-type things flying around, flying saucers. And, George, the one thing I didn't get to mention earlier in the show is that while we were in Sedona, my wife captured a large V-shaped craft flying over the desert by accident. We didn't even see it in the photo till we got home and were viewing the photos. And it's available at my website, supernaturalworldview.com. And there's actually some analysis by our graphics guy, and Stan Deo took a look at it as well. And I have Stan's analysis.
That kind of baffled him a little bit too, didn't it?
Yeah. He thinks it's a large craft in the distance, and that's what it looks like to me too.
Could be.
Steve Quayle took a look at it, and he thinks it could be a TR-3B type craft that's about to transform.
Let's go to final calls. Rose is in Butler, Missouri. First-time caller. Rose, you're on with Cris Putnam. Go ahead.
About the locusts, I believe that's probably our little drones, because I saw a high-speed video of a drone, and it moved in and out so fast. And the way it moved, I could see John, the Revelator, seeing that and thinking it looked like the locust, because if you remember when the locusts, what the old-timers used to call locusts out in the fields, they looked like their wings kind of looked like they buzzed around. They made you think of a grasshopper, but they weren't like a grasshopper. Do you remember?
Right.
You would remember, George.
I sure do.
And I was going to tell you that I didn't hear until this week and didn't realize that our Statue of Liberty was patterned after Isis. Yeah.
Now, what do you mean by that?
Goddess.
Yeah, so the question, when I look at those locusts in there, the one thing that I would say that I would argue perhaps counts against the idea that there's some kind of drones is that it says that their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lion's teeth.
Oh.
That, sounds like some kind of biological monstrosity to me.
Something that was developed in a lab that went awry?
Maybe some kind of hybrid or something like that.
How many universes might there be out there, Chris?
Well, it's kind of a funny question if you think about what universe actually means. Universe means everything, doesn't it? So how can there be more than one? It's almost incoherent when you think about what universe always has meant. But what we talk about now is this multiverse idea.
Yes.
And the scientists kind of have broken that down into 4 stages. The first one's uncontroversial. It just means that the universe is bigger than what we can perceive. So we can only look back so far, but it's actually bigger than what we can see. So there's unseen regions. And I don't think that's terribly controversial, that there's a limit to what we can observe. And so that would actually, it's not hardly really a multiverse since it's part of the same universe, but that's the level 1 multiverse. The level 2 is the one where there's actually parallel universes. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the brain world theory and those kind. And that is a legitimate, duplication of what we consider reality, I guess. And so that's where that starts. And then the level 3 gets kind of absurd, I think. It's the many worlds idea, where almost every decision breaks off into a new universe. So every time, it gets to be absurd if you think about it. Every
almost
time
like
one
bubbles.
Or a 0 goes by, the whole new universe is created.
See, they also say that going through a wormhole, you pop into another universe.
Right. And that's this idea I was talking about. Like in brain world theory, it'd be where the 2 membranes touch. So you think about 2 sheets hanging from parallel clotheslines. Those are actually 4-dimensional universes, okay? So we're breaking it down into a smaller thing that we can actually observe. Now the sheets kind of blow together and touch at a point. That's what they would call a wormhole, where you would have a black hole on one side and a white hole on the other, and you would actually be able to travel between those 2 parallel membranes.